Welcome to episode 15, Good Pitching Protocol and Best Practices with Jeff Zurschmeide.
Welcome to the PR Playbook podcast with Ranjini Joshua, the only podcast that teaches you how to strategically navigate the world of public relations and social media and grow a powerful brand.
And welcome to episode 15. Today I'm interviewing Jeff Zurschmeide, a seasoned journalist who has written for a wide variety of media outlets. Jeff is a longtime freelance automotive journalist about to transition to the dark side and become a magazine editor. Along the way, he's written 9 books and won a few awards, and he's generally enjoyed the process immensely. We'll have to hear about that. He lives in Tillamook, Oregon, where the cheese comes from, his wife, an unruly herd of cats. I wonder how big that herd is, Jeff. Thank you for joining me.
It varies from day to day. My wife is sort of the cat lady of Tillamook, and she feeds all the neighborhood strays. So there's always new cats coming around.
Oh wow! And have you named them all, or?
She has. She has named each and every one of them. I just say, it's that gray one over there.
It's that one, yeah. Well, yeah, I've often wondered where Tillamook is, and now I know. It is my favorite cheese, I'm not going to lie. It's good to have you here today. I always ask this question at the beginning, and since this podcast has launched, we've launched in the midst of this craziness. So it's a little bit loaded, but how are you doing?
Just fine. As a freelancer, social isolation is kind of a way of life. And when you live in a sleepy coastal town out in Oregon, walking to the grocery store and not encountering anyone except the checker is pretty much standard operating around here.
Okay.
It hasn't been that very different for me yet.
Yeah, well, it's nice. It's nice and quiet. I appreciate it a little bit. I'm not gonna lie, but I think it's an adjustment. I think for people like you and I who do work at home, maybe on a more regular basis, like you said, you're freelance. This adjustment is different. It's so hard to really understand because I'm used to this life where other people are really making a huge transition. Now, our biggest issue at our house is that everybody's home all the time and we have small children, so that's pretty loud.
Yeah. My daughter's 26, so not really a big deal for me.
Well, that's good. I hope everybody is doing well in your family.
We are.
Good to hear. So now I'm really excited to, have your perspective and give it to our audience, because these audience members are people who are looking for insight on the media industry, and maybe they're not looking for it, but I'm definitely giving it to them on different levels. So
Okay.
I'd love to get your perspective on the editorial process, and now that you're becoming an editor, I'd love to get a little bit more insight on really specifically what an editor does versus, a writer or a journalist. I think a lot of people can't tell the difference between the two. Everybody's lumped into one. So what is an editor's job specifically?
Well, for me, it gets to the big picture. As an editor, I'm thinking, up to 6-8 months out in the future. What are we going to cover? How am I going to fill these pages? And what direction do I want the magazine to go in? The magazine I'm taking over is called The Star, and it is the membership magazine for the Mercedes-Benz Club of America. And so that's very different from, for example, taking over Automobile or Road and Track, right? We have a pretty tight focus, not only just on Mercedes-Benz, but also on those cars and activities that are of interest to club members. So it's more of an enthusiast publication with a narrow focus. But regardless, I'm sure if we got my colleagues in here from any other print magazine, they would tell you the same thing. We're looking out in the future. We're trying to figure out what we're going to fill our pages with, and how we can keep the magazine interesting and informative, and generally make our employers and our readers happy.
I think that actually brings up a quick, interesting question. Who would your employer be? I mean, obviously, you're an enthusiast magazine. So who is your employer? I think it's important for people to understand that everyone has a boss and there's a dynamic everywhere. So who would that be? Yeah.
Yeah. And mine is particularly interesting because my employer will be the Mercedes-Benz Club of America, not Mercedes-Benz USA.
Interesting.
It is an independent club. It is not owned by Mercedes-Benz. Although obviously, they work closely together, but so I answer to the elected representatives of the club, who represent the members. So it's sort of an inverted pyramid with the members of the club on top, and then their elected leaders, and then there's a hired executive director of the club who deals with all the activities and getting all the stuff in order, and then I deal with producing this magazine. So in every issue, I'm thinking, what do the club members want to hear? What sort of feedback am I getting? How can I best make this magazine something that makes being a member of this club valuable to those members?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think I want to jump in and point something out here. And while we're talking about obviously the Mercedes-Benz Club, and it's very niche, I think it's important to understand that all the magazines, every media outlet has this same challenge and issue and kind of agenda. They have to have their agenda of meeting the needs of the reader and meeting the needs of their boss and meeting the needs of the brand. So while we're specifically talking about the Star magazine here today, this really applies to anyone. And so the reason this is important for marketers, PR people, CEOs, startups to know is that we really need to be mindful of pitching stories that are relevant to the readership and the audience of those particular outlets. And I think that's really the key here, is that we can't just serve our own purpose by pitching an angle because we feel like it's important. It has to have a why of it's important to those specific readers and to that specific target market. And so this podcast today is really focused on how to pitch and how to pitch correctly. So I think what we'd love to hear from you, what I'd love to hear, is really what are kind of the key things. I put 3 things, but it could be more or less. But when you're reviewing story angles, and not just pitches, I guess, story angles, how do you determine what to move forward with and what to ignore? And this little bonus question of how much space do you really have?
Well, first, let me say, 5 years ago, I was editing a newsstand magazine that was about hot rods and drag racing and muscle cars, essentially. And it was different then. I answered to a publisher who was interested in making money and, selling magazines. But I still needed to ask what the readers wanted to read, because if they didn't want to read it, they wouldn't subscribe, and the advertisers wouldn't advertise, and then everything would come apart. So it's completely not different.
Yeah.
When you are working a newsstand magazine, you still have to think about that relevance and providing good value. And so then to get onto your how to pitch, the answer with space is I never have enough space. There's always more stuff out there than I can possibly include. And it's not just picking what's relevant versus what's not relevant. It's picking what is the most relevant. I often describe it as like drinking from a fire hose.
Yeah.
Trying to, catch those things of the greatest value. So when I get a pitch, my first question is this relevant at all?
Right.
And then is it something that is relevant enough to make it something that I'm going to spend some effort on, maybe assign to a writer or write it myself, and then determine how much space. Is it a news bit in a page full of 10, interesting things you might want to know about, or not? And if it doesn't rise to that level, then it tends to get ignored.
Right.
The things that are completely off topic always get ignored.
Yeah, that makes totally sense. I mean, I think, well, I have so many questions. So I think it's very important. I'm sure maybe I'm going to ask this question just in advance now. How many pitches do you get a day? I mean, I feel like part of it is sifting through, right, the weeds. So for an example, like on average, and I'm sure it changes. I mean, right now you're in you're kind of transitioning, but how many pitches do you get a day, and what really draws your attention to something? And obviously one, is it relevant, but is there anything else, newsworthiness, timeliness, any of those types of things that personal interest? What are the areas that really draw your attention to a pitch? And then if you could give us like a rough number, what your inbox looks like.
Oh, I definitely get north of 20, some days north of 50 pitches in a day. I wake up and I come down to my desk with my coffee, and they are there waiting for me. And then they sort of roll in throughout the day. But let's drop back and talk to Jeff, the freelance writer, because up until a month ago, I had somewhere between 12 and 20 active clients at any given time. And those are just different websites and magazines that I was writing for, or had written for in the last month. On any given day, I had 2 or 3 articles to finish and some pitches to do to editors. To get more work. I often described it as standing on a riverbank with several fishing poles. And every time you cast your bait out on the water, that's a pitch that I'm making to an editor. And so I would sift differently through my pitches than I'm going to when I take over as editor of the magazine. Mm-hmm. And with that, when I was in that role, it was very much on me to pitch to some of my outlets, whereas other outlets, the editors would send me assignments. If I get an assignment, that means somebody pitched the editor said, yes, let me assign it to one of my writers, and they called me. Right. That was, I didn't have to put in any brain work on that. I just got the assignment and did it. Yeah. I mean, no brain work on the pitch, obviously brain work on the assignment. But, when I'm freelancing, and if your people are pitching to freelancers, things are a little more wide open, because I couldn't tell you in advance what pitches would be interesting to me next week, because I never knew when I was going to have an editor call up and say, hey, Jeff, have you heard anything about automatic coffee makers that'll brew you an espresso while you're driving in your car? And I'd say, no, I haven't. And they'd say, well, if you hear of anything like that, I'd be interested in a story. Mm-hmm. So, okay, fine. And then, if at that point a pitch comes in, hey, check out this new machine that makes automatic espresso for you in your car, I would say, aha, I have an editor that I can sell this story to.
But that has to be very serendipitous, right?
I picked a very serendipitous. Yeah. More likely, it's the editor saying, "Hey, we're interested in electrification and autonomous driving." Okay. To pick 2 things that many editors, up until about a month ago, were interested in hearing about, and I would then get pitches from places that would say, hey, we're involved in the autonomous industry. We have some new technology. Would you like to check it out? And that is a pitch that I would read. Okay. 90% of them, I scan the subject line of the email or the first line of the email, and then boom, my finger's on the delete key. Right. I'm really not interested in baby monitors. For some reason, I always got a lot of pitches for things like baby monitors and other household goods that I didn't write about because I was automotive. Right. Which goes to some of the best practices that we always say is, do your research on the person you're pitching. Yes. Absolutely. And the other one that always gets the delete key is anything where somebody is looking for promotion for their Kickstarter.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, we're not going to run a story on the idea that you have that you're trying to get funding for.
Yeah. Yeah, I know. This is a touchy place. So maybe for another podcast, but for sure, Kickstarter it's an interesting beast, especially from both sides, right? From your side, I know that media perspective. I've heard a lot of feedback on that, and then we worked in the Kickstarter or crowdfunding industry for a while, so I know the client's perspective of some of these people. Oh, I have a prototype. I have this. I have that, but nothing is ever certain. So it's hard to write about something that's not real.
Yeah, that's one of those. If there was a really good one, if somebody said, "Hey, I have a Kickstarter for a machine that makes you a latte in your car," and I love lattes, so that's
you're really focused on the coffee today. No?
Yeah, I always am. Then I would say that's great. Call me when you're ready to go to market.
Yeah.
When you've got a product and it's going to be available for sale, and I can tell my readers, here's a neat product. I tried it. It works. You can buy it here for this amount of dollars. Then I can pitch a story to an editor.
Sure.
But your Kickstarter, I could pitch it. The editor is going to say no.
Yes. Yeah. I think it's really important for people to hear that. So
absolutely. Yeah, but I think the message I would want to leave is, especially if you're dealing with freelancers, we don't know from day to day and week to week what things might be of interest next week.
Sure.
All I could tell you is I deal with automotive, and so if it's not automotive, don't bother. If it's automotive, and there's a real tie to automotive. If you make, I don't know, sheet metal screws, and it's like, yeah, they're used in automotive. Well, yeah, they are. But, if it's interesting and it's to do with automotive, I would never be angry or even annoyed that somebody sent me that pitch.
Right.
Even if I say no, it's not annoying. Baby monitors, that's annoying.
A little annoying. Yeah. Just to set a preface too, we've worked with you quite a bit on different stories. And you're always pretty generous with your time and feedback. I can't say that all journalists, or I think freelance writers, are a little bit more flexible because they don't know what kind of projects are coming their way. So I do notice that they're more conversational. They'll be able to riff back and forth a little bit more than a reporter who has a specific beat for a specific publication.
Right.
But I have noticed that, if you are realistic and authentic about like what you're approaching, some of the journalists, they will give you honest feedback, and they'll reach out to you. I think what the problem happens is when you're looking at these high impact magazines or publications that are producing a large amount of stories and people aren't getting back to you, people get, these people on the other end, we get frustrated or confused, or we're not sure. Maybe they still want it. Maybe they didn't see it. It's like all these questions that you're not really sure are there become present.
Yes.
So,
and there's also, I'm just a guy in Tillamook. I'm sure that the amount of pitches that roll into, a top A-list magazine is, it's an avalanche, I'm sure.
Yeah. I've heard up to 100 a day. That's probably the max I've ever heard. But I don't think I've heard anything more than that, which is, a phenomenal amount of emails that is just pitches. And remember, everybody has a job. So then you get your own, you get your emails from your different people that you're working with too.
Yeah.
I think one of the things is really important is understanding what makes a story successful. And when you're looking at stories, when you're writing stories, or you're going to be assigning stories, what are the metrics that make your story successful that we could keep in mind when we're pitching, so that we know that we're reaching or helping you reach those success metrics?
Sure. 3 things: relevant, interesting, and new. If I was to add a 4th, it would probably be accessible. Obviously the story needs to be relevant to the topic. if there's if you have a product for Audis, that's great, but it's not relevant to the Mercedes magazine.
Right.
It has to be interesting. Maybe you do have something that is very relevant and new and everything else. But if I can't make it interesting to where somebody's going to read past the first sentence, there's no point in me running it in the magazine. And then I'll get a call from my boss and saying, "Hey, this last issue was slightly less interesting than old dishwater.
Right.
Can you spice it up a little bit for next time?" So we have relevant, interesting news. It has to be something that is really new and newsworthy. You may have a new motor oil that allows your car to go 50,000 miles between oil changes. That's great, provided there aren't 10 others already on the market. So new is also good, and accessible is good, because if somebody spends the time to read a story or even skim over it and everything else, a lot of times at the end, they, especially with anything automotive, they want a call to action. How can I get a hold of this stuff? If I liked what I read about, where do I find it? And that's one of the reasons why the Kickstarters don't get covered is, where do you find it? Well, if you send these guys some money, maybe in a couple of years, it'll be a real product. Yeah, that's not exciting.
Right.
And so accessible, the fourth thing, is also key.
That's really good. I think that's very short and concise. I love that. What about your typical process? Like, how long does it typically take from starting a story to finishing a story? And I'm sure sometimes the deadlines are tight when it's like actual like news driven, time driven things, but like maybe a feature article or something. How long does that typically take you?
That is, it can range from 20 minutes to 2 months. And I say that because sometimes I get a pitch and I say, oh, I know exactly who to send this to. And so I write a quick email to an editor from the email that I received into my email saying, "Hey, I want to do a story about this thing I've heard of. These people say they've got, a widget that makes those coffees for you in the car. And it looks real. It looks legit. I'd like to do a story." And he says, "I've got a spot this afternoon. If you can get me the stuff, I will do it this afternoon." And at that point, I kind of, do the thing where you slide everything off your desk. And I write back to the PR person and I say, "Okay, I need the background information right now. I need to schedule an interview with your subject matter expert, ideally before lunch. And while we're doing that, go find me photos." That's another key thing. If you want a positive response to your pitch, have good photos that we can run. No magazine. I mean, I don't know, maybe the top buff books do, but I don't know. I certainly don't have the kind of budget to send a photographer somewhere and pay them to take pictures. That would usually cost me several times the amount of money that I'm going to make on the story as a freelancer. So having those visual assets ready to go, rights free, print it courtesy of Widget Makers International, that's a big help.
Yeah, I think one thing that you hit on, which is really important for people and often like they don't understand, is that if you're going to pitch something, you have to be ready to respond. And, with the resources, because I've had cases where, they respond a week later, we have a deadline, it's a week from now, we have some time. But I've also gotten those, "Hey, I need this by 5 p.m. And then I'll start reaching out to the client and the client won't get back to me. So it's you're in a push and pull situation and you're like, well, why did you pitch this to me if you're not ready? Right?
Yeah, absolutely. I've had that happen where I write back and say, "Yes, I can pitch this to, one place or 3 places or whatever. Get back to me right away. Here's what I'm going to need. And they ghost. You never hear from them again. It's like, well, all right,
Wow.
And especially if I've gone out on a limb with an editor to say, I have a story for you. And then they say yes. And I have to come back and go, well, they ghosted me. They didn't call me back. They didn't have any materials. I guess we're a dud. Then that's kind of a sad trombone for everybody involved.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I really, I'm trying to get everyone to understand that everyone has their role and piece in this thing. And if we work together, then it works out nicely. And if we don't, then I don't think anybody wins, right?
Nobody. Yeah, certainly your client didn't get the story and the publicity that they wanted. I, as the freelancer, didn't get paid for a story because I wasn't able to write it. And you, as the PR person, don't have something to put into your portfolio of what I achieved for you in order to earn my money.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's a really interesting balance and dynamic between all of the parties involved. But I think you've given us a lot of background and feedback. I think also on the editorial process, I really appreciate that insight specifically. And all the time that you've given us today. So I have a little lightning round of interest, but I think I already know the first answer based on what we've been talking about. So our lightning round to get to know Jeff better is a few personal questions. So our first question is coffee, tea, or water?
Coffee. Always coffee.
I'm going to have to send you a latte your way, a virtual latte for now. Chips or popcorn?
Fresh fruit.
Oh, okay.
I'm trying to avoid, doubling my weight during the pandemic lockdown.
Yeah, that's a good point. That's a good point. I diverged to popcorn recently, so I think that's why that's there. Dark chocolate or milk chocolate?
Milk chocolate always.
Okay. Carnivore, herbivore, or pescatarian?
Omnivore.
Omnivore. Okay, perfect. Drive, ride, or run?
Drive, definitely.
Drive, obviously, automotive. So what has been, this is kind of more of like an insight question, but obviously you've been pitched many different car companies and different things throughout the years. What has been your funnest thing, funnest project to work on? I'm sure you've gotten some opportunities to check out some cool cars in the past, I don't know, however long you've been doing this. So any cool experiences you've had?
Oh, yeah. Well, it's interesting. I went in at the end of February. I left and I went on the Alcan 5000 Winter Rally. And that was, as you might imagine, 5,000 miles, starting in Seattle and going up to Tuktoyaktuk, Northwest Territories, which is on the shore of the Arctic Ocean, where it was 40 degrees below zero and ice as far as you could see.
Wow.
About 200 or 300 miles above the Arctic Circle. And we went in a GMC pickup truck, and that GMC was good enough to loan me for the event. And it was really an adventure of a lifetime. Yeah. And had a great time. Wrote it up for a bunch of different outlets, and just had one of those amazing adventures that very few people ever get to have.
Yeah, well, experiential editorial opportunities are still a thing. Well, they will be, maybe.
Yes.
After this is over.
If any of your listeners, have wonderful classic Benzes that we can write about, or that they are doing some sort of adventure drive of their own in a Mercedes-Benz, please do let me know.
Yeah, I will. Absolutely. Thank you so much again for taking the time to come on the PR Playbook podcast and sharing your insights. You can find Jeff now, the editor of the Star magazine, the official publication of the Mercedes-Benz Club of America. If you have any pitches for him, please check out where you can reach him. We'll have that in our show notes and some other information about how to best pitch and tips on pitching, so you can better reach the editors that you're trying to reach. And as usual, if you have any questions, please send us comments, questions, or suggestions to podcast@thesilvertelegram.com. If you want to submit a story or pitch idea for a review, we'd be happy to take a look at it and fine tune it for you and shoot you a response. So that's all for now. Stay safe, healthy, and we cannot wait to hear your next pitch. See you next week.